or afternoon. Happy Sunday. So today's daf from the second Bava Batra is Chaf Vav 26. And yesterday we started the Mishnah at the bottom of Daf Chaf Hey Amud Bet, and this is a Mishnah again. We've been quoting ourselves referentially a lot. The Mishnah said that you are marchik a tree from your neighbor's field 25 amot because the roots of the tree can go in and cause damage at quite a substantial distance. But then that from a cistern. So then Rabbi Yossi, said that don't worry about it. Rabbi Yossi said in the Mishnah that you can plant your tree wherever you want. He plants his bor wherever, or he digs his bor wherever he wants. It's not your business. They do whatever they want to do. Says the Gemara now, 6 lines from the bottom. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yossi said, good morning, Claudia, just in time. Rabbi Yossi said, I'm a little late too. Rabbi Yossi says, even if the bor was first, so meaning the neighbor, how to do this, but the neighbor dug his cistern first, and then the other neighbor planted his tree, so that he's at fault. You don't have to worry about it. Lo yikotz. We're 5 lines from the bottom. This one.
Where's this? Where is he now?
Sorry, 5 lines from the bottom of Chaf Hey Amud Bet. You got it? One neighbor's digging his ditch or his cistern in his field. The other neighbor's digging his or planting his tree in his field. You don't have to worry about what happens across your border. Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, says Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, halacha ki Rabbi Yossi. That's how you paskin. So all these halachot we've been learning and discussing, Rabbi Yossi, in fact, is correct, and you can do whatever you want in your field. I don't know if that's how we paskin, but that's what Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel says. Amar Rav Ashi, ki havinan or havan be'Rav Kahana, right, when we were in front of Rav Kahana and discussing this Gemara, Havi Amrinan, he would say, Modi Rabbi Yossi begira didei. As we've quoted earlier, that although Rabbi Yossi basically says you're allowed to do whatever you want in your property and don't have to worry about what it's going to do in someone else's property, he admits that you can't do things that are essentially literally means arrows of you. We've had cases before. We'll have another case soon to illustrate this, where what you're doing in your field directly causes damage in somebody else's field. Remember, one case was you put up the ladder and the bugs were able to climb up the ladder to damage their thing. But if you do something that directly causes damage, that's a problem. It's only indirect damage that's not a problem. And we're going to actually, till the Mishnah, go through some cases that might clarify this, and they'll probably confuse it too. So, Papa Yona'a, 3 lines from the bottom. There's a guy named Papi Yona'a. I'm not sure what Yona'a. I'm not sure this was the name of a place. I'm not sure if it's Yevon or not. He's Greek, right? So this guy, Ani v'ha'ashir havi. He was a poor guy, but then he became rich. Not so clear what the meaning of why he was poor, but you know why that adds to the story. But the point is he's rich, and so he built Havibana Apadna. He built a padna is like a palace, like a home basically. And so he built himself a beautiful, nice, I don't know, summer home. And Havihanach Atsuri b'shivevute. There were these Atsuri. Atsuri Rashis are people who would grind sesame. So, which was a staple, of course, in their diet for everything. And they would grind it. I guess there was a lot of agitation. So there were these sesame grinders in the neighborhood. And Tchihavi Daiki Shumshimi, when they would grind their sesame, Havinaidi Apadna, his windows would start rattling, right? And so which happens, I think, nowadays too sometimes, right? So they were fracking in his neighborhood, we'll say, and they were causing all kinds of damage, and he was worried about the integrity of his house. So out to the Kamei Rav Ashi, he came to Rav Ashi, and Amalei, Rav Ashi said to him, Ki Havan be Rav Kahana, what we just quoted, when we were in front of Rav Kahana, Have Aminan, he would say to us that although in theory Rabbi Yossi's halacha is that you can do whatever you want in your property, so these guys can do their grinding as they want in their own property, Reb Kahana told us, Modi Rabbi Yossi begira delay, that Rabbi Yossi admits that you can't do it if it's directly causing damage. And now, how do you assess that? How do you assess whether this is direct or indirect? The kama. Now, how do you know? It's a very, so Rashi understands that kama here doesn't mean how do you know if it's a damage? How do you know how far away you have to be before you're allowed to do it? Meaning, how can you determine if my grinding of anything, but say grinding of a sesame is too close or not too close to the house? So the answer is kidinayid nachtama apunya dechatzva. It's where the nachtama, which is the cover of the barrel, rattles, right? So if the grinding it causes, this is sort of their objective standard. If the top of the barrel rattles when you do this, then it's considered to be too close.
Barrel in your house.
Barrel in your house, right? So meaning you basically can test it. You can say, put a barrel, see what happens. It's 25 feet, 50 feet, and it probably depends on what you're grinding, how big your grindstone is, what the ground is made of, a lot of variables. But that's the difference. So the top of the barrel. And Rashi says, a little interesting, Rashi says that it's talking about where you have a barrel and the top of the barrel will move because of the re'idah. How do you translate re'idah? Like the earthquake, right? Shaking. Yeah, thank you. Tosas is a little bothered, and again, I'm not so familiar with barrels in general, but Tosas says that seems to be like a very large amount, right? If you need the top of the barrel to shake, then it's like the house is almost falling down, probably. So, but then Tosas has another opinion, the Ritzbah, who says that really it's not, he agrees with Rashi and says that in fact, they used to use, obviously it depends on culture, they used to use a different material for the top of the barrel. So you would have something very solid for the barrel and you'd have maybe a much lighter or more mobile thing on the top. So that's not like the whole barrel's falling apart. It's that connection is not so good. So in any event, that's the shear where you have to, if it's causing shaking of the top of the barrel, that's considered to be direct damage. And therefore, even Rabbi Yossi admits that you can't do that next to somebody else's house because it's going to cause structural problems and cause the house to fall down. Now, the Bay Bar Miriam, with the top line of Daf Chaflav Amid Aleph, in the Bay Bar Miriam, in the house, or the family of Bar Miriam, Brei de Ravin, right? This was the son of Ravin. Kavi nafsi kitna, when they would nafsi means they would crush kitnas, flax, right? So they had a big factory, and they would process flax. I don't really know, flax. They would have to crush it.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's a grain.
It's reeds, and you have to crush it and pound it and then soak it.
Okay, I don't know if everyone heard that. Hopefully, we talk a lot about soaking flax in our Gemara, but right, it starts off as a long reed, and the flax seeds are inside.
It's not the seeds. You want the fibers.
Got it.
To make linen.
The flax fibers. Correct.
Reed.
So, but there's a lot of crushing, and there's a lot of chaff that comes off, right, when you crush it, because there's a lot of excess. So they had this big factory. They would be processing and crushing their flax. Havi azli rikta. Now the rikta, which is like the chaff, the extra sort of either pieces or like extra, whatever you call it in English, the things that fly away when you chaff. Thank you. But it's not it's chaff, but also potentially there would be little pieces that would fly off as well. Those would go out of their factory, umaski inchi, and they would hit people, right? So you'd be walking by this factory and you'd be assaulted basically by, it's like when they mow the lawn in front of you kind of thing, right? It would come shooting out at people. So people complained, how could you have this factory if you're causing damage from the byproduct of what you're doing? Now, again, this is the same question. Rabbi Yossi said, you can do whatever you want in your property as long as it doesn't cause direct damage. So how do we view this? So Atu the Kamei de Ravina, so the people came in front of Ravina and said, we want to get this factory away. He's got to distance it from the road. Amr Lu, and he said, Ki Amrina and Mod Rabbi Yossi begira delay. When we said that Rabbi Yossi admits that you're not allowed to do it if it directly causes damage, like arrows, Hani mili te ka'azni mikocho. That's where your own energy, your own force causes a thing to go, right? You are grinding, the koach that you're doing is what causes this to happen. However, hacha zikuhu de kamantile. Here it's the wind, right? If there was no wind, these things wouldn't fly off. So, they go up in the air, the wind blows them into the street, let's say. The wind is part of this. And since the wind is part of this, this is not considered to be your own direct power. And Rabbi Yossi would not prohibit this. So although the chaff is covering everyone's car and hitting them in the face and blinding their animals, the fact that it's necessary, it wouldn't cause damage without wind, means that although it's partially your fault, of course, it's not completely your fault. And therefore, this would be okay, according to Rabbi Yossi. Mar Bar Vashi was sitting there and he said, I don't understand. How in the world can you say that when I throw something up in the air and the wind carries it away, it's not my fault? How in the world can you have an Isser on Shabbat of Zoreh L'Ruach, right? Ma'ishna mizoreh v'ruach b'sayato. On Shabbat, one of the 39 melachot is you throw up your grain into the sky and the wind blows away the chaff and your grain comes down and you're chayav for skila, right? You're chayav for Shabbat. Why in the world would we be chayav if we say that the wind is doing it, not you, right? Because obviously you're not chayav in Shabbat for things that other people or other objects do for you. So if you consider the wind to be another force in this and that it's not my action, or at least not my sole action, then why would you ever be chayav on Shabbat? And that was his question. We don't have an answer in the Gemara. Says the Gemara continues though. Right, so we don't have an answer. Amru kamei de Meremar. Now they said this same question in front of Meremar, meaning these people built a factory, they're crushing flax, and they are allowing the chaff to go and hurt people or damage people. And Amalu and Meremar said, you're not allowed to do it, because Rabbi Yossi would admit, Hainu zorev ruach b'sayato. So he said basically, he paskin like the question on Ravina's psak, which is that in fact, because the wind is helping and the wind alone, I guess the wind is predictable, it's considered to be your direct action, and therefore, both on Shabbat you'd be prohibited, of course, and for damages you'd be prohibited from opening a factory where it's expected that your products are going to be blown away by the wind and damage other people on the outside. The Ravina, now this is going to Ravina, who said that it's not a problem, right? Ravina seems to hold that only it's what you do, right? What someone else does, or the wind or something assists it, you're not chayav. How could Ravina argue with the halacha that we had in Bava Kama, I believe, right? That let's say you're a Gates. A Gates is an iron worker, right, or a metal worker, and you're banging on something, and obviously sparks come out. So we said the halacha was you have a Gates, you have a spark. That's sorry, I said Gates is a spark. That came out from under your hammer, behizik, and it goes out and it lights something else on fire or causes damage directly. You're chayav l'shalim. Everybody agrees that you have to pay. Why, according to Ravina, do you have to pay? Why don't you say that it's partly my effort, but the wind took it out there, right? Something else made it go there. I didn't make it go to that place. Says the Gemara, that's very different. Because hatam nichale delezel. There, you know that when you bang something, you're going to have sparks, right, coming out of it. You orient, I should explain this whole thing. You orient the way you're doing something, if you're good at this, to make sure that the sparks go in the right direction. You don't want them to go into your store, you want them to go out of your store. So you orient the way you're banging and the angle. So you hopefully it's not too much background. You orient the angle and the way you're banging so that the sparks go outwards to where they went. And therefore, although you obviously didn't carry the sparks there, you desire for them to go there. And since you desire for them to go there, it's considered to be your direct effort. By the Zoreh L'Ruach, you don't really care where the chaff goes. And since you don't really care where the chaff goes, it's somewhat random, and therefore you would be patur for that action. Sorry, we're going to get quieter. So that's the distinction, but you can see that these nuances are very complex, right? Meaning when you do an action and the direct result of that action is to cause damage to somebody else, what's considered to be your direct action, which Rabbi Yossi says you're chayav for, and what's considered to be somewhat indirect. Of course, I would just point out, Tosas here discusses some of this, that there, of course, probably are differences between hezek, damaging, and Shabbat, for example, right? Which Ravina must be the difference between his case. Halacha and damage might be very different, but that is the way we conclude here, is that they were not allowed, according to Mar Bar Ravashi, right? That's what it is. They were not, Meremar, they were not allowed to have this factory, because even though the wind was moving it, right, it happened through automatically, basically, and therefore it's considered to be their direct effort, and therefore it's considered to be their hezek, and it's prohibited even according to Rabbi Yossi. Okay, we're up to the mission. The next case. Lo yita.
Ravina says no.
Ravina says no, right. I said it seems here that we pass like Meremar, but yes, Ravina disagrees. Ravina says that by the wind per se, since you don't care where it goes, it's according to Rabbi Yossi again, which is how we paskin, it's not considered to be your direct activity. That's correct. Says the Mishnah. Lo yita adam ilan samuch l'stei chaveiro. The next iteration of this is that you shouldn't plant a tree. Let's say you're planting a field.
What about the spark from the he wants it to go and cause damage?
So he doesn't want it.
It's
So
in
be clear.
Hichale that it should cause, that he directs it to cause damage to someone else's house?
So no, he doesn't want it to cause damage, but he wants it to go where it went, right? So nichale here does not mean he wants the outcome. It means he wants the process, right? So when you are a expert smith, you can sort of figure out which direction the spark's going to go in based on the angle and the whatever, however you set it up, and you direct your sparks to go outside to the field or outside to the Rishut Rabim because you don't want them inside in your store. So since you want the spark to go where it went, you are responsible for the consequence of that spark, even though you do not want the outcome of what happened, which is that it, burnt up your friend's field or something.
So he's still responsible.
You're still responsible, correct? You're still responsible because it's considered to be your direct action. That's an extension of you. Now, continues the Mishnah. Lo yita adam ilam samuch l'stei chavero. You should not plant a tree up next to another person's field, elam ken hirchik mimeno arba amot, unless you've distanced it from the field by 4 amot. Now, remember last Mishnah, you had a very different halacha, which is that you can't have a tree within 25 amot of a bor. But let's say there's no bor, right? Your friend's field is completely fallow, right? But you can't plant a tree right up at the edge. Why not? We'll see in the Gemara why not. It says the Mishnah, echad gifanim, echad kol ilan. It's not just grapes or vineyards, but any tree you're not allowed to do. We'll see in the Gemara. I guess I'll give it away. We've had this before, if you recall, that you're going to plow, right? It's natural to plow the ground. You have to plow the ground around your tree. And if you plant your vineyard up to the border, then how are you going to plow around it without going into your friend's field? So you have to allow space in your own field so that when you plow, you don't end up crossing over into somebody else's field. However, if you have a fence, then that problem's not existent, right? Because you can't go over the fence to plow. So you can go up to each side. Remember we discussed earlier, I'm going to have to marchik a little bit, even with this, but you can go up to the fence. Remember we talked about this. Now let's say either you planted inappropriately or you planted first, and then many years later, the roots of your tree ended up going into your friend's field. So in his field today exists the roots of your tree. Says the Mishnah, Ma'amik shlosha tfachim, there he is allowed to dig down 3 tfachim and destroy your roots for 3 tfachim, kedei shlo yakiv et hamachrisha, so he can have 3 tfachim, which I guess is the shear of the plow. Right? Remember, 3 tfachim is substantial, like 9 or 10 inches. His plow will go down. So he's allowed to clear out the roots of your tree, which ultimately will damage your tree, up to 3 tfachim for his plow to go. Now, if he wants to go even deeper, because he wants to dig, he wants to dig a pit or cistern or a well, then he can keep going. He can cut down the roots, again, not the tree, but cut down the roots further into the ground. You can go down 20 feet if you want. And he keeps the wood. Now, this implies, Gemara going to ask this question, that the person who's digging, the neighbor, not the owner of the tree, gets to keep the wood. That's one implication. It's actually not clear, right? Eitim Shalo just means he keeps the wood. So not clear who he is or the person is in this statement. We'll see in the Gemara.
And we're assuming that he's not telling his neighbor about it. He's just doing it because it's impeding on his property.
Correct. Or he could do it. I mean, he might tell him, but he can do it against his will. Yeah. If the neighbor says, I don't want you to do it, he has free reign to do it. Now, Tana, before we get, we're actually going to discuss in the Gemara, like I said, who keeps the wood, right? What's Eitim Shalo? Tana, now the Braita said, Arba Amot Sha'amot Kedei Avodat HaKerem. The reason they said 4 amot is because when you work a vineyard, which now explains why our Mishnah had to say both a kerem and a regular tree, meaning the standard size for a vineyard is 4 amot. Trees also, right? They also need 4 amot work around them to plow, to clean up the ground so that other things don't grow and they get a lot of nourishment. Says the Gemara, Shmuel, remember was Babylonian, this is only true in Eretz Yisrael where the land is not very good, right? Shmuel was a true died in the wool the Babylonian, right? Bavel, where obviously as we know, Bavel's lower and it's less rocky and it's watered much more, right? There's much more water in Bavel. Then only shtei amot. Then you only need 2 amot to plow around a tree and a vineyard. And therefore the shear for your field is only 2 amot, which again reminds us that this is all context dependent, right? So the facts change, things change. Obviously the halacha about what you have to do for nezek changes. Now, Tainami Hachi, in fact, there's a Braita that seems to support this. The Braita says, Adam Ilan Samuch amot. The Braita says you should only do 2 amot. And we asked on this Braita of Anantnan Arba amot. Our Mishnah said 4. Elalav, must be Kiddushmo. Shema mina. It must be like Shmuel. Now, it's not so clear. Does that mean like Shmuel that the Braita was talking about Bavel, which would not be the most usual thing, right? Braitot were in Eretz Yisrael. Or if the Braita is making the point that it depends on the context, right? In places where it's very fertile land and things grow really nicely, then it's 2 amot. And in places where it's not, it's 4 amot. And obviously there might be places where it's even more than that. And theoretically, even in Bavel, it can be more than 2 amot if it's not good land. And as we've had, again, several times already in this Masechta, Ika de Ramile Mirma, some people ask this as a contradiction. And it said, our Mishnah said, Tznan, we're at the last word on the first wide line. Tznan, our Mishnah says, our Mishnah, it's a quote, says you can't plant a tree unless you have 4 amot from your border. But the Braita says Shtei amot. And Shmuel answered and said, Lokashi, come Bavel, come Eretz Yisrael. Depends on your topography, right? If you're in Bavel, you only need 2 amot. If you're in Eretz Yisrael, you need 4 amot. And therefore, that's the standard shear based on your location. Now, Rava bar Rav Chanan. Now, we're going to get to a couple stories of our agricultural rabbis, right? So Rava bar Rav Chanan, Havile Hanu Dikli, a mitzvah de Pardisa de Rav Yosef. Okay, so Rava bar Rav Chanan had dikli, had palm trees, big trees, obviously that took a lot of space, a lot of ground space, right? And they were on the border, meaning next to the field of a pardes. Usually pardes means vineyard or orchard. Here we're going to say it means vineyard, but fruit trees, basically, in this case, grapes, of Rav Yosef. So they were neighbors. And Haviati Tzipori, now there were birds used to come, and Yatvi Bedikla, they would sit in the tree, because birds love sitting in the tree, and they would notice that next door to them was this delicious lunch of grapes. The Nachti Bepardesa, Mafsidile, and they would go down into the pardes and they would eat all the fruit. And so Rav Yosef, who owned the trees, right? Sorry, the opposite. Rav Yosef owned the pardes. Rav Yosef said to Rav bar Rav Chanan, Amalei, Zilkots, go cut down your trees, because you're ruining my vineyard. Even though you're next door, these birds are coming and causing damage because of your trees. Amalei said, well, I don't have to cut them down. I did what I'm supposed to do. My trees are 25 amot away, or whatever shear from your field, right? They're far away. Birds can fly, right? Ha'archikali, I distanced them the appropriate shear. I'm supposed to distance them from your field. Amalei, so he said to him, Rav Yosef said to him, well, the distance is only hanimili ilanot. That's only for trees. That's a set appropriate distance. Avoligafanim ba'inantfei. You need more space away from my vineyard or my grapes, because birds will come and eat them. Said Rava bar Rav Chanan. I've learned the Mishnah also. Hanansan, our Mishnah said, Echad gifanim, echad kol ilan. What do you mean, Rav Yosef? That's not what our Mishnah said. Rav Yosef said, no. What I meant was hani mili ilan li ilan ugfanim li gfanim. Our Mishnah was specifically if you're planting one species next to the same species, a tree next to another tree, or a vineyard, or a pardes next to another pardes. Aval ilan li gfanim b'inantfei, for this reason. If you plant a tree which is higher up, which gives more view, which animals will come to, and it's next to my geffen, you need to make it further apart so that the birds are not tempted to just jump down into the field, grab some grapes, and go back up to their nests. And because of that specific circumstance, you'd have to distance it. Now, that was Rav Yosef's claim. Now, Rava bar Rav Chanan was not convinced, but he was a nice guy. So he was willing to start cutting down his trees, even though he did not think this was the halacha, because Rav Yosef was, damaged, and he thought, and aggrieved, let's say. But he said to Rav Yosef, I'm not cutting them down. Look, I'm okay with that. We can get rid of these trees, but I personally am not cutting down my fruit trees. The Amar Rav, because they had a very big, hakpada against cutting down fruit trees. As Rav was quoted as saying, Hi Dikla, let's say you have a dekel, a palm tree, the ta'in kaba. It's a dying, an old palm tree, and it only provides 1 kav of dates a year, which is much less than usual. I don't know what the usual is, but kav is considered to be a very small amount. So it's just barely eking out a few dates a year. Asr the miksai, you still can't cut it down. Remember, we talked about not cutting down fruit trees, isr bal tashchit. So Rav said, even if it's now if it's dead, you can cut it down, or if it's not producing, you can cut it down. But even if it's producing only a small amount, you're not supposed to cut it down. So said Rava bar Rav Chanan, I'm not cutting down these beautifully healthy trees because I want to do you a favor, basically. And furthermore, said Rabbi Chanina, very hard story, Lo shachiv shachacht bri My son Shachach, which is quite a name for a child, right? My son, the forgotten one, only died because he cut down a fig tree. Is a fig, right? A fig tree before its time. So said Rava Rav Chanan, I understand your point. I don't think you're right lahalacha. Tosfos points out, if you were right lahalacha, I would cut it down, right? There's no prohibition about tashchit. It's something that halachic that you have to cut down. That's not for nothing. That's for a valid reason. But I think that this is not necessary. I will not cut it down. But Mar, you Rav Yosef, if you really want that tree gone, you're welcome. Here's a saw. Go cut it down. So he basically acted, I would say, lifnim mishurat adin in some way. It's a very interesting story, right? But I said, you can cut it down because I see that's causing you damage. I don't think it's technically a problem, but I personally don't want to be complicit in the cutting it down.
Yeah, there's a story with his name Shachach. There's a trauma story
Exactly.
there.
Rav Papa, no, 6 lines from the bottom, the next Amora who's working in the fields. Rav Papa, Havile Hanhu Dikli, a mitzvah de Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua. Rav Papa had dikalim, had his palm trees. On the mitzvah, it's actually gonna be a little complicated technically what it means here. We've always translated mitzvah as the border, right? Is the space between the two fields, right? So he had his trees right next door to the field of Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua. Azal. So one day, Rav Papa goes, Ashkechei Davi Chafar. He sees that Rav Huna, Breder of Yeshua, is digging down, right? He's digging down in his own field. The Kakayat Shorashav, and he encounters the roots of the trees of Rav Papa from the next field over, and Rav Huna, Breder of Yeshua, is cutting down, is sawing away the roots of Rav Papa's tree. Amarle, he said, "My hi, what are you doing? Why are you cutting down my roots?" He said, well, what do you mean? It's a Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Tnan, how you shurashim yotzim l'toch shel chavero, if the roots are going into somebody else's field, ma'amik shlosha kadei shel yakev ha'machresha. You can dig down 3 tvachim so that the plow is not interfered with. And so I'm well within my rights to destroy your roots that are in the field. But Rav Papa said to him, I understand that you're allowed to do that 3 tvachim, but you're 20 feet into the ground, right? Shlosha, ahani mila shlosha. The Mishnah said you can go 3 tvachim. Marka chafar tvei. You're digging much deeper. You're 5 feet down, cutting through my roots. Why are you allowed to do that? He said, well, because I want to dig a cistern, right? Remember our Mishnah said, Amar le anna barot shichinu marot kachfarna. I'm digging a cistern. I need a very deep channel here to store my wool. To the field. And in our Mishnah clearly said, you're allowed to keep doing it. So therefore, I'm permitted to cut into your field, into the roots of your tree. Now, Amar of Papa said, again, he's talking about himself in third person. Amrile Kuli, I told him all these things. We don't know what all these things are, but I told him all these different reasons why he's wrong and why he should spare my roots. And he didn't listen to me. Again, we don't know what all of Papa's convincing arguments were. But Papa said, I negotiated with him all day, and I was not able to convince him to spare my roots. Turn the page, until I quoted for him this Gemara, this Mishnah, Braita, sorry. This statement of Amarayim. Had Amar of Yehuda. I quoted to him the statement of Rav Yehuda, which we had a couple weeks ago, that Meitzar shechziku barabim asur the kalkalo. That if you have a meitzar, if you have a boundary that has been taken over by the rabbim, it's been adopted for position by use of the rabbim, you're not allowed to take away that use, even though it's your property. And so I quoted that to him, and then he said, okay, fair enough. So the question is, what does that mean? What's the context here? So Tosfos very somewhat forcibly says that it means that this actually was what happened here. That this border was the property of Rava bar Rav Chanan. I'm going to get the names wrong, sorry.
Rav Papa.
No, not Rav Papa, the other one I'm looking for. Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua. Yeah, Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua. I was not even close. And that Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua was basically cutting down Rav Papa's roots that were in this border area owned by Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua that was used by the Rabbim. And because it's used by the Rabbim, he basically lost his ownership right to it. And therefore, Rav Papa is allowed to have his roots there. And it's not interfering with the Rabbim, right? They're walking on top of it. But therefore, that was sort of the argument, which is a little bit of an anomaly because what does a Rabbim have to do with anything? So Rashi understands, and Tosfos, one Bali Tosfos agrees with Rashi, that it's an analogy, basically, that just like there, basically what happened with the Rabbim is the Rabbim started using it. You never protested, right? You didn't put up signs, and therefore they acquired the rights to use it. So the same thing is true here about Rav Papa, which again, it's very complicated. The Rav Papa's tree had been growing for, I don't know, 30 years, and the neighbor never objected. And if you don't object, you lose your right to object. Right, which we'd have to define how many years, what time, et cetera. But that was what he was saying, that you knew about these roots, you knew they were there, you never did anything about it. You wake up one day and decide you want to build a cistern, you don't have the right now to start ruining my roots, just like if the Rabbim is using your field, you don't have the right after a while to stop them from using it. That's how Rashi understands it. It's sort of an analogy.
So the
So,
Rabbim were using the field, just say like that.
but I agree. So that's the problem with Tosfot. The problem with Rashi, of course, is that it's a strange case to bring of Meitach Zigo Rabin, which is a specific case of using the public. I mean, the fact that public people get rights does not mean that individuals get the same rights. Right? It's a little bit of a jump to do what Rashi did. But your question is correct as well.
Give up your property.
Right. I mean, we're going to see, of course, the next parak, which we're going to start tomorrow or 2 days, gets us into that whole discussion about chazakah, right? About when people are assumed to ownership or not ownership based on living there. So this is not exactly chazakah, but you could see how it's very closely connected to the concept of, holding something and giving yourself rights because of that.
So what
Anyway,
does Rashi say that he's since he's held it for 50 years or whatever, that he doesn't have that he doesn't have the right to cut down the roots?
Where does Rashi say?
He's talking about the Rabbim.
Keep going. The next words. I have been machzik in this. So I've had a chazakah, basically. I've had a right in my tree with the roots going into your field. We don't, again, it doesn't define here what that chazakah time is, right? How long is it? But it's not like you just discovered that my roots are there. You knew my roots were there. You just decided you wanted to build a cistern, but you can't do that and ruin my roots after a period of time, whatever that period of time might be. Let's keep going. So that was what Rav Papa finally convinced him to stop cutting down his roots. And then he went on his way.
So he's combining these two concepts then, the Rabbim plus the chazakah, right?
Correct. I agree. That's Tosfos's problem again. But that's how Rashi says it. Now, after Rav Papa went away, so Rav Papa convinced him to stop cutting the roots. So he put away the chainsaw, and Rav Papa went on his way. But after Rav Papa went on his way, Amar Rav Huna Bar Yeshua said, "Oh my gosh, I forgot. I had a great comeback." Of course, you always think of these too late. Rav Huna said, "Amaylo Amrile, why didn't I tell him that the difference is kan betoch sheish esrei amma, kan chutz l'sheish esrei amma? That it depends whether you are within 16 amot of the tree." Meaning, Rashi explains, we're going to get into this concept even further later today. Right? We've had a shir of 4 amot, we've had a shir of 25 amot. Now we introduce a shir of 16 amot, which is that even though our Mishnah said yesterday that a tree needs 25 amot to grow, the essence of its growth is within the first 16 amot from the trunk. And so the particularly vulnerable part of the roots is 16 amot. And so it might be that you're not allowed, like the Rabbim, remember the Rabbim area is 16 amot, the Rishut Rabbim is 16 amot. So you might be that you're protected for 16 amot from a tree, but not beyond that. And I guess what he was cutting down here was beyond 16 amot. So it was within 25, but beyond 16. So he could have said back to Rav Papa, you're no longer protected outside of 16 amot. There I'm allowed to do whatever cutting I want to do because it's not considered to be damaging to the essence of your tree. But he didn't think of saying it, and Rav Papa had already left. Continued the Mishnah. I don't know
that it has to do with the essence of the tree. It's just that he says that anything beyond that can affect me, cause damage to me, and I'm allowed to remove 16 beyond 16 amot. But who said it doesn't cause damage to the tree?
We're going to see. I mean, the words Rashi uses and the words Gemara uses are "ena yonkim." It doesn't nourish it from that part beyond 16 amot. But we're going to actually discuss 16 amot today and maybe some tomorrow. Continues the Gemara. 5 lines on the top. Yaakov Hadaiva, Rav Chisda. Rav Yaakov Hadaiva. Hadaiva Rashi says he was min Hadayev, wherever that is. Rav Yaakov asked Rav Chisda, Eitzim Shamni, who gets the wood, right? So Reuven has a tree. It's in Shimon's field. Shimon's allowed to dig down and take rid of the roots, but the roots are a lot of wood. Who gets to keep that wood? So Amarle, so he said, Rav Chisda said to Yaakov, Tinitua, we have a Braita, Mishnah actually, in Mesechet Me'ilah, I believe, yeah,
Mhm.
that will explain the answer to the question. Because what does the Mishnah say there? Let's say you're Shrashei Ilan Shel Hedyot. You plant a tree, you have a field that belongs to Hektish next to a field that belongs to a Hedyot, to a regular person, right? Of course, you're not allowed to get benefit from Hektish. That's called Mi'ila. So if you planted your tree in Hektish's field, you'd be Chayav Mi'ila, let's say. But you plant your tree in your field, but your roots go into the field of Hektish, right? So says the Mishnah, Sharashei Ilan Shel Hedyot, you have the roots of a tree belonging to an individual or a civilian. Haba'im b'shel Hektish, they grow into the field of Hektish. Lo na'anin v'lo ma'alim. You cannot get benefit from the roots of that tree, not from the tree, but from the roots of it. Let's say you cut down the tree and the roots are there, but they grew into someone else's field. So these roots came from Hektish's field. You are not allowed to get hana'ah from them, but you're not chayiv mi'ila. The fact you're not chayiv mi'ila means that they're probably not considered to be hektish. Midrabanan, we don't want you to enjoy it, but they're not considered to be hektish, meaning that the roots of the tree go after the tree. So since the tree is hedyot, the roots are hedyot. And so there's no mi'ila, even though they grew in the field of hektish. Right? We're trying to resolve the question of whether roots that grow in someone else's field are part of the tree or part of the field. You go batar ilan after the tree or a batar sadeh, right? So this implies, so it says right now, that you consider the roots, even roots growing in another field, to be nourished or be part of the tree, then mishum hachilo mo'alin. So then since the tree was from a hedyot, you're not chayiv mi'ilah for the roots that grew in the field of hektish. But if you say that the roots belong or are part of the land, right, then the land is hektish. Amai lo mo'alin, right? You should be chayiv mi'ilah because it grew in hektish. So it must be that the roots are part of the tree, and therefore, if Reuven's tree is growing in Shimon's field, Reuven gets the roots because he owns the tree. Ella says, Gemara, 1 second. Elamai batari lanaslian. So therefore, you're concluding from this Mishnah that you go after the tree. But then read the next part of the Mishnah. It doesn't make any sense. Ema seifa. The next words of the Mishnah are shel hektish haba'im b'shel hedyot. If you have a tree of hektish that's growing in a hedyot, so the opposite, the hektish tree has roots in the hedyot field, and then you cut down the hektish tree, and you've got all these roots that were growing in another field. Lo naniv lo ma'alim. You also cannot get hanan, can't get milah. Right now, iamre ibata ilanas linan. If it's as you just tried to claim that you always go after the tree is in hektish's field, so the roots should be hektish, right? Amai lo ma'alim. Why aren't you chayiv hektish? Media area, it must be, Rashi understands this continuation of sort of the statement, it must be that bigidulin haban lachar mikan askinan. What happens here is we're talking about growths that happened after the fact, meaning you planted the tree, you gave, the tree's planted, let's say, I then dedicated this field and all the trees in the field to hektish. So that moment, the whole thing became hektish. And then over the next 5 years, things grew from it, right? And the roots of the tree, or even outside of the roots, but let's just say the roots, grew in Hektish's field from Hektish's tree. But the Tan of our Mishnah holds, Kasavar, and it's a big machloket, Mesechet Mi'ilah, Ein Mi'ilah B'gidulin. That Mi'ilah, there's no concept of Mi'ilah and things that grew after the fact. So that if you give something to Hektish and then it grows, there's no Mi'ilah. And therefore, basically, this is somewhat of an in-between circumstance, right? So this Mishnah, we're still asking a question, but it must be that the Mishnah is talking about a case where you're not chayiv mi'ilah because you're not chayiv mi'ilah b'gidulin. We still are unsure why. How can it be that both the first case and the second case don't have mi'ilah, right?
But I thought gidulin in Me'ilah was where like it's a whole, like you have an onion and another bulb comes out of the onion in that second one. But if you have trees, like if fruit trees they're continuing.
So it's
tree.
right. So it's a big discussion in Mi'ilah about which I'm focusing on going down. It's a little easier about what gidulin mean, right? Because Claudia pointed out, so gidulin can mean like sort of very potential growth or immediate growth, right? If you have an apple tree and you dedicate it in March, and then in June it's full of apples, are those considered to be gidulin or not? So the Mishnah actually discusses a lot of these cases about what's gidulin and what's not.
Well, there could be potentially huge profit if that's the case. If a person, well, something grows afterwards, was initially active, but the growth is not. It could be worth millions of dollars to that individual, and it's not either.
100%. That is 100% correct. That's the whole halacha of gidulin. It's a machloket. It's not a universal opinion, but that's the sufficient opinion of this Tana, according to our Gemara. Ravina says, but the way you have to understand this Mishnah, Lokashia and Mi'ilah, is kan betoch sheish asar amma, esrei amma, kan chutz sheish esrei amma. You have to understand that it depends on whether you are within 16 amot of the tree or outside of 16 amot of the tree. And that basically, in essence, according to Ravina, a tree supports itself, or not supports itself, support is supported by the roots that go 16 amot away from it. So when the Mishnah in the first part of Me'ilah said that you are not chayav from Me'ilah, even though the tree basically is growing in Hektish's field, it's because we're talking about outside of 16 amot. So the tree is growing in the Hedyot's field. It extends 16 amot in the Hedyot's field, and then 18th amma is in the Hektish's field. And there, it's not Me'ilah because you don't really get essential nourishment of the tree from Hektish. You're not supposed to use it because it looks inappropriate. The second case in the Mishnah is when you are within that range. And so when you're within that range, meaning that the tree, of Hektish, which is growing, they say an opposite. The tree of Hektish is the opposite way, The tree of Hektish, which is growing in Hektish's field, is outside of the range in the field, in the Hedyot, basically, of 16 amot. So again, the nourishment is considered not to be from the tree itself, right? It's considered to be, or not essential, I would say, is the word I meant to say, for the tree itself. And so when you're within 16 amot, you are chayav mi'ilah if it was in the field of Hektish. But what the Mishnah is basically telling you is that when you're outside of 16 amot, you're no longer chayav. And so this is the distinction. Again, our Mishnah, just to repeat it, yesterday talked about 25 amot, but we're introducing now for the second time this concept that a tree essentially nourishes the main part of its tree within 16 amot, and that's the part that would be subject potentially to Me'ilah. So that is Ravina's answer to the question.
There's both ways, right? Whether the tree starts in Hektish or the tree starts in Hedyot, right? Then it would be Chayav Me'ilah if it's beyond 16, right?
Correct. If it's, well, no, because if it starts in Hektish, you're not Chayav Me'ilah beyond 16, because only 16 goes to Hektish.
Right. If it's beyond
Correct.
16, one is done. But if the tree starts in Hedyot and
Correct.
ends up in Hektish,
It has to be beyond 16.
be also beyond 16, right? If it's within 16, no, there doesn't apply there.
Correct. It does not apply there.
At all.
Correct.
Because it started in Hedyot.
Right. So it goes after the tree.
So there's no Me'ilah then. At all.
At all, but you're not, well, you're no, but lo na'anin, but the Mishnah's halakha is it's still inappropriate. It looks inappropriate. Continues the Gemara. Let's do a few more lines, even though it's 8:30, because this will get us to tomorrow's daf. It's a fascinating daf tomorrow, like every day. Amar Ula says a very interesting halacha, which is Ilana samuch le'meitzar. If you have a tree that's next to somebody else's border, mitoch sheish esrei amma gazlanhu, we consider that to be inappropriate. Your tree takes a standard tree, takes 16 amot of essential nourishment, we're going to say. If you plant your tree 10 feet away from your neighbor's field, then the nourishment of your tree partially stole from your neighbor, and you're considered to be a gazlan. Now, Rashi does not understand that to mean what I just said, but I'll explain in a second. The ein mivian mimenu bikurim, and from the fruits that grow from that tree, you cannot go to the Beit HaMikdash and bring bikurim. So Rashi explains, Tosfos here has a whole discussion about this as well, very long discussion, that it's not literally that you're stealing. It's that there's a specific halacha in bikurim which says, asher tavi me'artzecha. You have to bring it from your own land. And this is not considered to be your own land, because since an essential part of the tree nourished from your neighbor's land, it's no longer called artzecha. And so that's Ula's halacha, that if your tree is planted within 16 amot of your neighbor's field, you're not allowed to bring bikurim from that tree.
But can the neighbor bring bikurim because it grew in his field?
No, it's definitely not his field alone. It grew partially in his field, but it grew very much majority in your field. The point is that even you can't bring. You mean from his trees, not from your tree?
No, your tree grew in the neighbor's field. So now the fruits from there, but don't they belong? Maybe they belong to the neighbor because the nourishment came from the neighbor. Maybe he can bring bikurim.
So he certainly can't for many reasons, but the first being that's not his, but he certainly can't bring. But no. So
can anyone benefit from it?
Yeah. So Rashi's understanding, Tosfos goes through whether it's gezela or not, is that this isn't in fact considered to be stealing, but it's not considered to be artzecha. So that in fact the person whose field it is allowed to use it and is allowed to benefit from it. Maybe the guy can bring him to court and can claim he's ruining his land, but it's not considered to be his fruit. But it's not considered your land. The issue is not the fruit. The issue is the land. Now, let's analyze this, and we're going to go through this a lot today and much more tomorrow. Well, not a lot today, a little bit today. Ask the Gemara, Mina leila ulaha. how does Ula know that a tree around itself needs 16 amot, right? It seems like a somewhat arbitrary amount. Now, it could be, of course, he was a good farmer, but there has to be some source in the halacha. Ilema miditzna. Now, there's a very famous, and we had this Mishnah many times, because it's for many reasons, but I'll explain why. A Mishnah called Esther Nitiot, right? It's a very famous halacha of 10 saplings. And the halacha is basically, and I'll go very quickly, in Shemitah, is that you're not allowed, let's say Shemitah is next year, you're not allowed to plow your field within a few months of Shemitah. Because if you have a field, you're plowing it so that you could plant it next year, but you're not allowed to plant it next year. So they prohibited you from plowing your field from Pesach, really, if it's an empty field, like a stay near. Halacha is if you have saplings, you can plow it till later. The reason you can plow it till later is because you're not plowing it for the next year. You're plowing because these saplings are going to die unless you plow it. So since you need it for this year, until Shemitah, you're still allowed to plow. So the Mishnah says in Sechet Shvi'it, if you have 10 nitiot, 10 saplings, mifuzarot betoch beit sa'ah, they are spread out within a beit sa'ah. Remember, a beit sa'ah is an amount of space of a field that you could plant a sa'ah, plant enough seeds to get a sa'ah of grain, which is 50 by 50 amot. Okay, so within 50 by 50 amot, if you plant 10 trees, then you're allowed to plow the whole field because that's necessary for the trees. Chorshin kol beit sa'ah b'shvilan ad Rosh Hashanah, up till the time of Shemitah, right? So you're allowed to plant, if you have 10 saplings in a field, then they need the nourishment of that whole field. And therefore, you can plow the whole field for that year, right? For right then until Rosh Hashanah. So this is a Mishnah. So Ula, right, read this Mishnah.
That's the opinion of Rabban Gamliel in Shvi'it. Rabban Gamliel holds until Rosh Hashanah, basically, in most things.
Again, we're not going to get into Shemitah for now. But the point of the Mishnah is that, not yet. The point of the Shemitah of the Mishnah is that it takes a field of 50 by 50 to nourish 10 saplings. So Ula is going to do the math. How much of the field does each tree need, right? So we could do our math together, right? 50 by 50 is 2,500 square amot, right? If you have 10 trees, each tree then needs, is that what he said? 10 trees, 10 divided by 2,500 is 250, right? So each tree needs 250 square amot around it. Now, Reb Ula said you need 16 by 16. So I don't know if anyone here can do math quickly. 16 by 16, if you can't, Rashi does it for us, is 1,000 amot, 1,024 amot. So the Mishnah says you need 250 amot, and Ula is saying you need 1,000 amot, right? He's way off. So let's read that inside.
He's a merchant.
Let's read that inside. So Kama havilahu trey alpin v'chamesh mea garmidi, right? Altogether, 50 by 50 is 2,000 trey alpin and 500 garmidi. Garmidi is amma. So 2,500 amot. They could do 50 by 50, right? The chol chad v'chad kama matile. Each tree gets how much divided by 10? Matan v'chamishin, 250. Halo havi de Ula. That is not the share of Ula. Ula said you need 1,024 amot for each tree. So this Mishnah in Shvi'it, which is where I'm going to stop, seems to contradict Ula. Now, of course, tomorrow, as you guys would, I'm sure, imagine right away, the Mishnah is going to point out, he wants to point out two problems with this Mishnah, or not problems, two differences. One is that it's talking about saplings, right? So by definition, saplings need much less space than mature trees, right? So now how much, we'll have to see. If it's 4 times, it works out perfectly for Ula, right? Because Ula said a shear that was 4 times the saplings. But the other point the Gemara is going to make tomorrow, just so you bring your geometry tools, is that, of course, when Ula said you need space around it, he didn't mean a square, right? He meant a circle, right? You don't need a square around a tree. So if you have a circle, of course, that's a smaller area than a square. Now, the Gemara, as you know, has its own issues with pi. And so tomorrow we were going to discuss how much it is different for a sapling and how different it is for a square or a circle. And it's going to turn out to be exactly like Ula. So stay tuned for tomorrow.
Thank you.
Shavua Tov. Good to see everyone.
Shavua Tov. Thank you.
Miriam, when are you coming back?
The 7th?
Okay. Well, maybe we'll see you next week in Yerushalayim.
Yes.
Okay, great. Shavua Tov, everyone.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.